and I'm Pat Chamberlain. Well, I came from a community in Warren County. The high school, and his name was Alvaton, and that's where I had my 4 years of FFA experience. I was vice president 1 year and president 2 years, and then went on and was elected secretary of the state FFA organization in 1959. And I was, my father had a substantial dairy farm that actually we rented the farm, but that was our main agricultural activity, was dairying. Well, on the one hand, how it helped would be difficult to really pin down, but I know that it's been significant. One of the things that happened during my years in FFA was the fact that we studied our Constitution carefully, that was in the FFA manual. And for example, that was largely instrumental in equipping me to write a constitution to start the first student council ever at Western Kentucky, now University. The president asked me one time if I knew how we could go about having a student council. I said we'd need a constitution, and I wouldn't be surprised if the constitution I wrote and they used just like I gave it to them was primarily modeled after the FFA manual constitution. But you know, all 4 years of vocational agriculture, and in my case I took it also in the 8th grade, the idea of planning a crop or planning a farming enterprise, writing out your plans, your long-range goals and those kinds of things was so deeply instilled that it probably impacted in some way almost everything I ever did by way of work, you know, the work I did. After college, I taught secondary school 2 years. After a brief semester at a UK School of Law, I entered the Presbyterian ministry and did work in Appalachia in the early years of 1975. And there were a lot of enterprises I was involved in that had to do with the kind of plans, oddly enough, when you were trying to do these various activities to relieve poverty conditions in Appalachia, it would involve making the kind of plans that kind of became a knee-jerk reaction in taking vocational agriculture. And as a matter of fact, even though I was a Presbyterian minister there, and it was a kind of a missions kind of ministry, I became the chairperson of the ASCS. And we were able to, again, organize a number of activities that had significant impact on conservation efforts in Clay County, where they really hadn't done much of anything like that ever in anybody's memory. So I can say that it seems to me like a lot of what I did would have been a lot more difficult had I not had the FFA experience. In my high school experience, for, you know, like many high school boys, probably the fact that they played basketball and maybe they played football and that kind of thing would have been their dominating experience through those 4 years. My dominating experience, that was everything, had to do with vocational agriculture. And it was the subject area of the 18 courses I took. I felt like I got more out of my agricultural classes, the 4 units, than I did any of the others. I guess if it will work to speak of events, when I became secretary of the FFA state organization, five of the officers, and I was one of them. We went to Washington, D.C. for a week for a leadership training event, and for me, never having been out of my home county much, that was kind of the first time I ever went to Washington, D.C. It was the first time we visited the Senate cloakroom and this gallery. We visited the House of Representatives. And on one day, in those days, Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House. He came to one of the meetings with all of we young men from all over America. He came and spoke. Lyndon Johnson was the Senate leader. He came and spoke. Gerald Ford came and spoke. He was the Republican, the minority leader. And then we FFA boys presented Dwight Eisenhower a FFA blanket in the Rose Garden. And I met John Sherman Cooper. We all met John Sherman Cooper, who was our senator. And John F. Kennedy had just decided to run for the presidency, and he was there. And so all five of us shook hands with him. That had a profound impact on me. I'd always been interested in politics, and I'd been interested in history. I majored in history as one of my majors in college. So that was a hard experience to forget, primarily from the standpoint of all these political figures that I'd read about. My major source of information was not, we didn't have television. It was the Courier Journal that got delivered out to our rural areas. So that whole experience was a really a profoundly helpful one to my education. Now that's just, that was just very educational. It had a big impact on my understanding of the world. The other one is probably much deeper, was when I was one of those 9 FFA boys that went to South Korea. The Kentucky chapters of FFA and the Kentucky chapters of FHA jointly worked for a year, collecting all kinds of materials that included everything from scissors and thimbles to chisels and bicycles and sewing machines, all kinds of things that Korean folks needed in 1960, that being 7 years after the armistice. And so 9 of us, 1 from each district, we went on the freighter where we had, I think it was either maybe about 19 to 21 breeding stock dairy cattle. And they selected us for 2 reasons. One was to ride the freighter and take care of those cattle, because they correctly assumed that the normal deckhands and ship workers wouldn't know anything about cattle. So we took care of them, and then when we got there, the second role was to be goodwill ambassadors. So we traveled all over the peninsula. The depth of the experience was primarily the fact that there were virtually no trees bigger than small saplings anywhere left in the peninsula, excepting the mission compounds, Buddhist monastery and religious places, their palaces back when they had a king and a queen. They had a kind of a winter palace in the summer. We toured all those. Those were not bombed, but Korea was a kind of a scorched earth peninsula. So we had the experience of traveling for 10 days at several points every day, everything from orphanages, small colleges, special schools for children. One of the profoundly impacting places we visited was where little kids who had lost hands and arms in the war were learning how to use their artificial hooks on for their hands or legs, arms and things of that kind. So I think all of us were deeply affected by realizing this is what it's like a few years after a really, really destructive war had taken place. And I might add that in the city of Seoul, which has a lot of hillsides rising up in all directions, a lot of the housing in 1960 was more like what I was accustomed to out on the farms in that era when farmers would gather together pieces of tin and old doors and things and make a hog house, a hog shelter. A lot of the families were living that way. It was my first experience of seeing homeless people, men and women with their children would just kind of sleep on the ground or on benches and that kind of thing. So, and I might add that their per capita income was $67 a year per person. That's kind of how poor the general population was. So I think all of us came back recognizing that war was not a good thing. And that when it does happen, it really has a deep impact. Since that time, I've learned that a lot of the scorched earth policies that the military used in Vietnam and Southeast Asia were sort of developed and to some degree perfected in Korea. That 10 days would almost have to be classified as a life-changing experience.
Do you have any recollection much of how these materials and everything came to be to get onto the freighter ship? Did different chapters in the state raise money or collect things? I don't remember much about it. Could you share about how that happened?
Every FFA chapter and every FHA chapter were given lists of these were the kind of things they needed. For example, I donated a very good bicycle. Bicycles was their main form of transportation at that time for the whole peninsula. There were not many automobiles on the streets anywhere when we traveled, even in the capital city of Seoul. Really, of course, money was collected and the cattle were purchased with a plan in mind. This is what kind of cattle they needed and so on. But of course, in some cases, chapters were able to collect money, but people selected these things that they had on their farms and in their homes, and these things were all eventually transported. I don't really remember where the central location was, whether it was Lexington, but these things then I think were probably loaded on a train and taken to Pensacola, Florida, and then they were loaded on a kind of a slow boat to China, kind of a freighter that we rode on. We departed from there with the cattle and all of this equipment that however many FFA chapters and FHA chapters there were, all collected and put together. The material was sifted to some, that is, you didn't take things, they didn't take things they thought weren't quite up to a quality level that they needed. But it was it required a lot of work with vocational education teachers and future homemaker teachers. A lot of parents were involved in that, and a lot of us were involved in chapters all over the state, bringing it all together. My vocational agriculture teacher came when I'd finished my freshman year of high school and had not succeeded in finding anybody to go to the state convention with him. I think somebody thought was going to at the last minute, had something to keep him from it. So he asked me to go, and that's the first time I'd kind of ever been away from Bowling Green. That's the biggest town I'd ever known. But of course, I was impressed with going to the big city of Louisville, and I was impressed with staying in a hotel. But that caused me, I went to all the meetings at the convention, and I came back with a much wider understanding. This is what you can do when you're in FFA. So the fact that he decided to come and get me, just a freshman kid in high school, to go there probably kind of jump-started my interest in FFA. The national convention was something that I never could afford to go to in high school. When I was elected a state officer, we did go to Kansas City to the convention, and somehow I thought that Kansas City was ordained by God to be the place where all national conventions would be held. And this is not quite what you get out of vocational agriculture, but my most sobering experience there is I went as a state officer. We became a part of something called the Courtesy Corps, and that meant a couple of ag teachers and a couple of us FFA boys walked around making sure FFA boys attending the convention didn't get out and get into fights with local gangs in Kansas City. And we got kind of near and had conversations with a number of these gangs, and I just didn't know things like that happened with human beings. I didn't know boys got together in gangs like that. I mean, I thought green walnut fights in the country is about as violent as it ever got. That happened where I grew up, but I didn't think about boys ganging together and trying to do harm to each other in that way. My experience of going to Hardensburg for the camp, I did that 2 years. And in the first place, they had swimming classes, and that's where I learned to swim. Somehow we didn't have a swimming hole available where I could have learned that kind of naturally. But the head of the camp, he wasn't just the person that made sure the commodes were functioning and that kind of thing. He was kind of a head teacher. I think they called it leadership training. I think that's what they called it. And buddy, he did it. I mean, he had all kinds of the old blue mimeograph pages that he would do with a list of these are this is how you need to conduct a good meeting. This is how you need to keep records when you, so in either one of those 2 times we went, I'm trying to recall his name. I think it was Bato, but I'm not sure. Or it might have Maddox, I'm not sure what, but in any case, he was the one, I think, who was responsible for bringing together all these materials. And they were, as far as I was concerned, quite good. As a matter of fact, I was going through files about 3 or 4 years ago, and I can't keep everything, and I still had some of those pages that I got back there in high school. So that touches on the state convention and the national convention and the leadership training. But every year I went to a state convention, I always got a great deal out of that. They were also organized in a way that you got some real content.
Tell us a little bit about your high school ag teacher.
Well, I mentioned already that Mr. Wilson was responsible for getting me to go to the convention that year, and fortunately my father could figure a way to do without me for 3 days or so. My father had become a farm tenant by the time I was in high school, and in our community there was not necessarily an expectation that the VOAG teacher would work as vigorously with tenant farmers' sons as he would with other kinds with farm owners' sons. And besides Mr. Wilson being he was a very decent man with good, strong character. He was always pleasant, but he was an extremely fair individual that never allowed himself or anybody else to do anything about the way contests were conducted, how classes were done, how elections were held. He was always pleasant and congenial about it, but it had to be done right. And so my experience with him was very good. Again, if I look at my 4 years of school, I remember fondly more things about my vocational agriculture teacher than I do any of the others. That's not to say that they weren't nice, good people. But one way or the other, I knew he stood with me, so to speak, when I was doing what I needed to do. And as I mentioned earlier, those 5 years actually of vocational education, a large volume of the content that I got in those 4 years of all of my high school experience came from having that one class each day, each of 5 years.
Well, let's conclude, Pat, with any ideas or words of thought or direction that you would give young people today about the FFA and how they should operate within the FFA today.
One of the things I did was I read the FFA manual from front to back a few times. From my personal experience, one of the clearest memories I have is the importance of a constitution. In America, we have a constitution. And there's a lot of casual talk about going by it. I think, at least in my case, and I think probably in every other FFA chapter, if it's effectively run and overseen by the vocational agriculture teacher, they're going to have an experience of living by that constitution that's in the manual. And one might say with the chapter meeting team contests that are held every year, and I think every FFA chapter will have a chapter meeting team competing somewhere. In our case, we learned all the parliamentary law procedures backwards and forwards. That kind of fits in with the Constitution. I'm wondering if a lot of FFA members really take advantage of what they can get out of knowing how they're run with kind of the principles in the manual, the Constitution, and the principles that are involved in parliamentary law. One of the things I did in my college years is I organized at Western Kentucky University, I organized a parliamentary procedure demonstration team. And we would go to high school sometimes, and down on the gym floor before 200 or 300 students, we would do a demonstration where in 15 to 20 minutes we used all the procedures there are in Robert's Rules of Order. And John Sherman Cooper happened to be visiting that school back when he was a senator, and he listened to our presentation. And he said, I looked up at him, and he was wiping tears away from his eyes with a handkerchief. And afterwards he came around, and I was, of course, the leader of the group, and he came around to me and he said, "Son, if there was just any way I could take all of you to Washington and let you do this demonstration in front of the Senate," he said, you would put us to shame. Now, I'm not trying to make a crack at the Senate and however it did things because I wasn't there, but it seems to me you ought not to be able to get through being an FFA member for 4 years without having a profound respect for both constitutional procedures and your group that way, and particularly parliamentary law. That's one of the things that's really stuck with me again and again and again, is seeing where things could have been helped if people had had that kind of grip on both constitutional procedures and using the systematic ways that there is in parliamentary law.